Holocaust use the word Shoah, and they will immediately go, whoa, you know what you're talking about. You know, you're taking our feelings into account with all of this, okay? Before we talk about the conflict in the Middle East tonight, we need to ask an important question. And here's the question that we need to ask. Why is there so much hatred in our world towards Jews? There have never been a people group in the history of the world that has faced more hatred and more persecution than the Jewish people have. And here's the thing, without understanding the answer to that question that I just asked, you can't properly make sense of what's happening today in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism has been called history's oldest hatred. It has taken many forms over the centuries. But what I want to do as we begin our session tonight is I want to talk about a few reasons that have been given by historians for the hatred against the Jews, all right? The first one is this: religious beliefs, right? The Jews were seen as Christ killers. By the way, that's bad theology. They are not Christ killers. But they were portrayed throughout the centuries by mainline churches, by the Catholic Church, as enemies of the Christian faith. So you had early church fathers like Tertullian, Justin, Marcion, who all described the Jews as Christ killers. Martin Luther, you know his name, right? He was the father of the Protestant Reformation. He called Jews devils. And it was the anti-Semitism that was present in the church for centuries that actually set the stage for the Holocaust in Germany, right? Jules Isaac confirms this in his book, Jesus in Israel. So, the first reason that the Jews are hated are for their religious beliefs, for religious reasons. Now, I want to talk to you about something, but I'm going to let our guest speaker next week talk to you about it in greater depth. Something called replacement theology. How many of you have heard of replacement theology? Replacement theology has been taught for centuries in mainline churches, and it's the reason that the mainline churches have persecuted and killed Jews. Replacement theology simply says this, that the church has replaced Israel as the apple of God's eye. In other words, it states that Israel has lost her chance for salvation. That when they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, they no longer had any hope of salvation. That as a nation, as a people, God is finished with Israel. And now God has moved on, and the church has replaced Israel in God's covenant. So you had early church fathers like Justin Martyr and John Chrysostom who started teaching that view in the 2nd century AD. And when they started teaching that view, all of a sudden, Jews came under persecution. Jews began to get killed by Christians, right? Then in 313 AD, when Constantine declared Christianity to be the official religion of Rome, that move was disastrous for the Jews because even greater persecution began. So I'm not going to say anything more about replacement theology tonight because next week Bishop Robert Stearns is going to talk to you about that topic in depth, okay? It is a very important topic. It is a horrible theology. It is anti-biblical. There is no truth to it, but I'm going to let him unpack why and all of that stuff next week, because next week you're going to get to hear from him. How many of you have been here when Bishop Robert Stearns has been here at Life Church? Good, a good number of you. And for those of you that haven't, he was supposed to have been with us not too long ago, and then he got sick that weekend and couldn't come. It was earlier in the year, in March, but he'll be back again in 2024. But if you haven't heard him, you'll want to hear him. He is amazing. He is one of the foremost experts on Israel and Jewish things, as well as being an incredible worship leader. He leads Eagles Wings Ministry. By the way, if you're interested in more information, the book that we recommended, if you go to our website for this class, is the Watchman on the Wall manual that has been produced by Robert, okay? And a lot of these things that we're talking to you about, it's all in that manual. And if you go to their website and order it, and you put in this special code, all capitals, STAND. If you just use that code, STAND, all capitals, you'll get 20% off the price of the manual. So I think right now in this season, they're selling it for $15, and then you get 20% off of that. But that is a great reference book, or reference manual for all the different stuff that we're talking about. So anyway, Robert is going to be speaking next week, and you'll get to hear him and his take on some of the things that are going on. But in 1933, we're still talking about why are the Jews so hated? Because of religious beliefs. In 1933, the Vatican signed something called the Concordat. They signed that with Adolf Hitler, officially recognizing the Nazi government in Germany and vowing the allegiance of its priests to Hitler. All right? You need to understand that the Vatican never opposed what Hitler enacted in Germany towards the Jews. Why? Because they believed in replacement theology. They don't really care about the Jews. It wasn't until 1960 that the Catholic Church finally renounced anti-Semitism. So for centuries, the Catholic Church was anti-Semitic. And in 1997, the Catholic Church repented and admitted its direct role in the Holocaust. But you need to understand that the Protestants were no better during World War II. And the Protestants mainline churches have been no better throughout the centuries. Martin Luther, as I said a moment ago, the father of the Reformation, was a horrible anti-Semite. We thank God that he started the Protestant Reformation, that he stood up against the Catholic Church. But sometimes even our heroes have flaws. And Martin Luther's great flaw was that he was an anti-Semite. He believed in replacement theology. And Martin Luther called for the extermination of the Jewish people. Now, here's why that's important. Because Luther became Germany's most famous and beloved theologian. So who do you think started quoting Martin Luther beginning in the 1920s, all the way through the 1930s, and all through World War II? Hitler. His best quotes came from Martin Luther to support his view that the Jews should be exterminated. He said, look at our most famous theologian, Martin Luther, said we should exterminate these people. I'm just doing what Martin Luther said. I'm just carrying it out. Right? I have a phrase, and all of the students in Life School of the Bible have heard it, and all of my Sagu Life students have heard it. Bad theology leads to bad things. Bad theology has bad consequences to it. Martin Luther had bad theology when it came to the Jews, and 6 million people died because of it. Because Hitler used him as his poster child. So the first thing is their religious beliefs, all right? Second thing, cultural differences. Jews have always been different. Jews have always lived differently than other people. Jews refused to intermarry. They observed Sabbath. They observed circumcision. They lived in community. They stuck together, all right? Very tight-knit community. Very family-oriented. Remember, it was God's intention for the Jewish people to live differently. Why? So that they could be a light to the world and they could point the way to Him. And if you're living like everybody else, you can't point the way to Him. It's the same truth that we as Christians are to live by today. We're supposed to be different from the rest of the world. Why? So that we point the way to Jesus. So if we're the same, if we're doing the same things, if we hold the same views, if we have the same morality as our neighbors who don't know Christ, how are we going to be a light? Well, that's the same principles with the Jews. And so because of cultural differences and because the Jews have always been different, there's been a lot of hatred and bigotry toward the Jews. The third reason is jealousy. The Jews have always prospered wherever they have lived. And this is an interesting historical study. The Jewish people would go into a town that was just destitute, that the economy was bad, that it was going nowhere. And as soon as the Jews would arrive in that town, guess what would happen? the town would begin to prosper. And the people of that town, as they saw their town begin to prosper, then got jealous of the Jews. They wanted to steal their wealth, and they would drive the Jews out. And it was always the same excuse, because you hear this from anti-Semitic people today. The Jews want to take over the world. The Jews want to take over Wall Street. The Jews just want the money. You know, why are there so many rich Jewish people? Well, I'll tell you why, because God's blessing is on them. I mean, that's just the plain fact of the matter. God has blessed them with the ability to prosper. And so they would go into these towns that were destitute. The towns would start to come alive, and then the people would get jealous of them and angry at them, and they would drive them out of town. So you know what they would do? They would just move on to another town, and the same thing would happen again. God would start blessing them, and they'd get driven out of that town, and this is where a lot of the persecutions came from. There was also a lot of jealousy over the fact that they were called God's chosen people, all right, amongst religious people. Now, when we talk about the Jews being God's chosen people, all right, that doesn't mean they're his only people, all right? God loves everybody equally. But when we use the term God's chosen people, it's not a term of exclusivity. It's these are the people that God chose to bring us Messiah, to bring us Jesus, all right? So a lot of religious people saw that. Well, who do you think you are? It's really like Joseph when he had that dream, right? And his brothers are like, well, who in the world do you think you are? You with your coat of colors, and you being father's favorite, you know, they got him, they throw him, and they tried to do what? They tried to kill him because of jealousy, right? So that term, chosen people, it refers to God's use of them, not that he loves them more than anybody else, okay? Some interesting facts about Israel is this, that Israel, whether you realize it or not, is the 100th smallest country in the world with a population of 0.001% in relation to the rest of the world. However, get this, it has the highest standard of living of any nation in the Middle East. Again, God's blessing. We'll talk about that more in a minute. They lead the world in technology and inventions. They are the only democracy in the Middle East. They have the highest ratio of university degrees to population in the world. Israel has more museums per capita than any other nation. They're the largest immigrant-absorbing nation on earth. They have been blessed, all right? They have been highly blessed. So because they have been so blessed, everything they put their hand to prospers. There's a lot of jealousy when it comes to the Jews. Now, when they were given the land in 1947 by UN resolution, you have to understand that the land of Palestine was a barren desert wasteland. Nobody wanted it. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. The British had won it from the Ottomans in World War II, and they wanted to get rid of it because it was nothing but problems, all right? It is a barren desert wasteland. Nobody could get anything to grow there. It was junk land. But in Isaiah 35, verses 1 and 2, God said this, I will cause the desert to bloom. It was a prophetic word about what God was going to do when he brought his people back to the land. And you know what? The Jews have caused the desert to bloom as prophesied. They lead the world in agricultural advances. They have the largest number of startup companies in the world. Did you realize that voicemail was developed there? Email was developed in Israel. They developed the Centrino processor chip for the first computers. The first computer antivirus software was developed there. The cell phone was developed there. Technologically and agriculturally per capita, Israel is amazing. God has blessed and prospered them. And in 75 years, when you see the city of Tel Aviv, all right, that modern city on your TV screen, understand that 75 years ago, that wasn't there. None of that was there. It's like they rose out of the ashes to develop all of Israel. And so they have this amazing agriculture. People go there from around the world, arid places, to study. How are you doing this? How are you getting the desert to bloom? All of that stuff, all right? So anyway, third reason is just simply jealousy that they're hated so much. Fourth, and this is an important one, is demonic assignment. You cannot discount the fact that Satan hates those that God loves, and that includes you and I. The conflict in the Middle East does not make sense unless you understand that there has been a demonic plot from the pit of hell from the very beginning to wipe out the Jews. And it started in Genesis 3:15, right? With that prophetic word, that he will bruise your heel, that whole thing, right? And I talked about this in the Revelation series. Who was the woman, right? And the Jews were the first woman that the enemy attacked because it was through that woman, through the Jews, that the Messiah was going to come. And then it was Mary, and now it's the church, right? Because they were chosen to bring God's blessing into the world in the form of the Messiah, and through them came the revelation of God and biblical principles brought to the world, there's been a demonic assignment placed against them. So here's what I want you to understand tonight. When we talk about what's going on right now in our world, it is a spiritual battle. I know there are flesh and blood sides that are fighting, but what you need to understand is that this is a spiritual battle. That's why different rules apply to Israel than to any other nations on the planet. Have you noticed that in any of the coverage and anything you've watched and seen, that when it comes to Israel, they have to live by a different standard than the United States has to live by? When we went into Iraq, when we went into Afghanistan, nobody was asking the questions to us that they ask to Israel. Nobody was holding us to the standards that Israel is being held to, correct? Different rules apply to Israel. Why? Because this is a spiritual battle. All right? The hatred against the Jews is demonically inspired. That's why it doesn't even make sense. When you, how do we have people, how do we have a congresswoman who gets up on the floor of Congress and who out in public talks about that she believes that what happened on October 7th was a good thing? How can we have a congressman that's pro-Hamas? You can be pro-Palestinian because you're Palestinian. We're all pro-Palestinian here tonight, but we're not pro-Hamas. We're not pro-terrorist. We don't advocate what they have done. We don't buy into it. We don't condone it, right? But we have a heart for the Palestinian people, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But how can you have someone be that blind and stand up and say those things? Because this isn't a battle against flesh and blood. What people say and do in this battle does not make sense because it's demonically inspired. And so the enemy is using all these people as puppets, and they don't even realize they're being used. Because half the things that they say, number one, are not true, and number two, they don't even make sense logically. Are you with me? Have you found yourself, watching some of these things going on and scratching your head and going, this doesn't even make sense? Have these people lost their minds? And the answer is yes, because there's a demonic deception. There's the demonic veil over people's eyes. And we as believers have to understand that when we're dealing with this issue. From the very beginning, the enemy has tried to wipe out the Jews, all right? So the hatred toward the Jews in Israel is demonically driven. The fifth thing that I want you to understand is they're hated for political reasons. The rumor has been circulated throughout the centuries that the Jews want to take over the world, especially financially. This has created a lot of hatred, a lot of persecution. When we come to political reasons in the Middle East, The Israelis are seen as occupiers. We're going to talk about that. Is that true, right? They're seen as having stolen land. You have all these political reasons. But at the end of the day, none of them hold water. And then finally, the Jews are hated so much just simply because of misinformation. People have a lot of misinformation about the Jewish people in Israel. Lies are told all the time by their enemies. And that's why I'm teaching this class, so we can dispel the lies and we can share the truth with you. Unfortunately, you and I are seeing right now that anti-Semitism is alive and well, and we're only 70 years after the Holocaust. Think about that. We are only 70 years on the other side of World War II, the Holocaust, the greatest atrocity in human history, and you have incredible levels of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that is thriving on our college campuses. And I've been saying for years and have been warning that the stuff that's being taught on our college campuses has been anti-Semitic. Well, now the fuse has been lit, right? That's why you need to be informed with the truth. Right now, the Jewish people need friends. It's only been in the last 40 years that they have found friends amongst evangelical Christians. Now, this is really, really important. Jews do not trust mainline Christians because of replacement theology and hundreds of years of persecution and killing, right? But in the last 40 years, as evangelical Christians have reached out to them and have proven themselves to be friends to them, the Jewish people in the state of Israel have warmed up to evangelical Christians. They're the ones that they trust, all right? And so that's really, really important. In 2008, I got a chance to be a part of, I went with 8 pastors to be the first delegation that met with Orthodox Jewish rabbis. All right, we were the first group of Christian pastors. We met for 3 days in Jerusalem with Orthodox Jewish rabbis, and they taught us and we taught them. It was an incredible time. That's the first time that kind of dialogue had happened, and I can tell you that the Orthodox rabbi that set that up really took it in the throat. There are a lot of people in Israel that didn't understand. A lot of people in Orthodox Jewish rabbis, they didn't know, what are you doing meeting with Christians? And that was kind of a break the ice moment after years of them finally believing, boy, you're helping us. You really are our friend. You really would stand by us, right? God's promise to the Jewish people in Isaiah 62, 6 and 7 says this: I have posted watchmen on your walls, Jerusalem, and they will never be silent day or night. You who call on the Lord. Who is it that calls on the Lord? It's us. It's talking about us. You who call on the Lord, give yourselves no rest, and give him no rest till he establishes Jerusalem and makes her the praise of the earth. So the call for us as believers, and again, we'll talk more about this in a moment, is to stand with Israel. We are to be the watchmen on the walls. It says, you who call on the Lord. That's us. That's Christians. That's believers. Give yourself no rest, right? Until God establishes Jerusalem and makes her the praise of the earth. So it's very right for us to study these things. It's very right for us to stand and defend the Jewish people's right to exist as a nation and as a people. And make no mistake, that's what this is all about. And you're going to see it more and more as we get into this stuff. So now let me just talk about, for a moment, why do we stand with the Jewish people? And what does it mean to stand with the Jewish people? So there's this famous quote by Sir Edmund Burke. And Sir Edmund Burke said this: the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. As Christians, God is calling us to do something in this hour. He is calling us to pray for and stand with his people. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said this: the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And there are a lot of people, there are a lot of Christians that are just They don't hate the Jews, but they're indifferent. Elie Wiesel said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's just simply indifference. It's not caring. As Christians, we have to stand with the Jewish people. And the time has come now when we're going to have to decide whose side are we on. Again, Israel has become the dividing line in the world. And when we decide, here's what I'm going to tell you. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be comfortable. In fact, it will be costly to stand with Israel. Do you see even now how the nations of the world and the peoples of the world are lining up against Israel? And the longer this conflict goes on, the greater the pressure will become on all of you from your coworkers, from your family members, from your neighbors, to cave and not support the Jewish people. And that's the pressure that our nation is going to face. If you ask me what my number one concern is right now, my number one concern in this whole conflict is not whether the Jews are going to win the conflict or not, because they are. They will win. My number one conflict or cause for concern is, will America win? And here's what I mean by that. Up until this point, our president has stated unequivocally that we stand with Israel and that Israel has the right to go in and do what they need to do to get rid of Hamas. But my concern is, for how long will he be able to hold that stance? Because right now, many of his own party members are calling for him to demand a ceasefire. People all around the country are calling for him to demand a ceasefire. They're out protesting. They're out doing this. Will he be able to? Because, you see, to stand with Israel is costly. It's not comfortable. It's not easy. Just like it's costly and uncomfortable, and it's not easy to stand for Christ in this world, right? It's the same thing when it comes to Israel. So my greatest concern is that America will cave and turn its back on Israel. And when we do, we're going to be in trouble. And we're going to come to that in a second. All right? So why do we stand with the Jewish people, and what does that mean practically? Okay? Why do we stand with the Jewish people? Number one, because the Jews gave us the scriptures and the Jews gave us the Messiah. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. That's why we should stand with God's people. Never forget this. The roots of Christianity are Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. He was not American. He was not German. He was not Japanese. Jesus is a Jew. Notice I didn't even say Jesus was Jewish. Jesus is Jewish. Right? We have to remember that. We owe them a debt of gratitude. The Bible says very plainly in the New Testament that we, the Christians, were grafted into the Jewish vine. We didn't start out here on our own. We come from their vine. We were grafted into the vine, all right? A second reason that we stand with Israel is because there is a biblical mandate for us to bless the Jewish people, right? God said in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And through you all, the families of the earth will be blessed. Through you, Abraham, the families of the earth will be blessed. So there's this biblical mandate that we are to bless the Jews. We're to stand with the Jewish people. The third reason for standing with them is because our welfare as a nation is tied to their welfare. So the day America stops standing with Israel is the day that God lifts his hand of blessing from America and we fall. So here is something interesting. Nowhere in any end-time Bible reference can you find a reference to America in the end times. When Jesus returns, when the nations gather in the valley of Megiddo for the battle of Armageddon, there is no reference that you can find to America anywhere. I find it very interesting. Have you ever wondered why? Here's an interesting thought that I picked up from Jonathan Cahn. America is the only nation that's holding back evil from taking over the world. Now think about that. If we weren't the military power, if we weren't the superpower we were right now, what do you think would be happening already in Israel? Who do you think would have descended on Israel? The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, just go down the list of names. What is the only reason that those nations are not getting involved? America, right? They don't want to tangle with us. That's not a boastful statement. Thank God we have that ability, right? Think about it. America is the only thing that's holding back these evil nations from overtaking the world. Because if America's out of the picture, who's going to stand up to the nations of the world? Great Britain? I don't think so. By the way, how many of you know when the vote was taken in the UN last week to condemn the actions of Hamas, that Great Britain abstained from the vote? Do you realize that that resolution in the UN to condemn the actions of Hamas did not pass in the United Nations? The only ones that voted yes were America and a few other nations. Great Britain abstained. You know what an abstention is, right? It's a coward's no. This is why Britain is all messed up. Once the most powerful nation on the planet, right? And so there are all of these things happening. Again, there's this dividing line, right? So if we're not in the picture when you go to Ezekiel 38 and the nations come out of the north to attack Israel, how are they going to do that? America's not in the picture for some reason. So my concern is, one, either we get defeated, or number two, we turn our back on Israel, God lifts his blessing on America, and we get defeated. Because look at, the only reason that America's a nation is the same reason that Israel's a nation. Because God intervened. America should have never won the Revolutionary War against the British. There are so many stories about the Revolutionary War that do not get told to school children today, about God's marvelous hand of intervention in battles that we should have lost. I mean, as simple as when George Washington, down in the Hudson River, was surrounded by all the British armies. And that night, God sent a fog that was so thick the British armies couldn't see. And Washington, with his troops, were able to escape across the Hudson. And when the fog finally lifted and the British went, "What?" They're gone. Just miracle after miracle. The same thing is true of the wars that Israel's been in. We'll talk about that a little later. But just a thought for you tonight that our welfare is tied to Israel's welfare. So we need to be aware of that. Fourth, because they are human beings created in God's image. Let me see. Try and get back to my thing here. My screen keeps going off. All right. Fifth, we stand with Israel because of the Abrahamic covenant. The Jewish people have a right, a biblical right to the land in which they reside. And next week, our friend Bishop Robert Stearns is going to explain this in great deal to you. The fact that God has not ended his covenant with Israel, as some people would lead you to believe in replacement theology. God promised that the Jews would return to the land, and they have. So he's going to talk to you about two key figures. We'll get into a little bit tonight. I'll give you some background so you understand what he's talking about, and then he'll fill it in. About two key figures in the return of the Jews to the land. A guy by the name of Theodore Herzl, who is the father of Zionism, and William Heckler, who was an evangelical Christian. Those two men paved the way for the modern state of Israel to be born. Most people don't know this, but in 1917, Great Britain owned the land of Palestine. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration was made, which proposed giving the land to Israel for their own state. And that declaration became the basis upon which the UN resolution was made in 1947 to create two states, One for Israel and one for the Arabs. Did you know that? So when we talk about two-state solutions, did you know in 1947, the Arabs were offered a two-state solution? A state for Israel, a state for the Arabs. And you know what happened? Israel accepted the proposal, but the Arabs rejected it. And so on May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel was born, but there was no Arab state because they refused, right? So I want to just say this. What does it mean to stand with Israel, all right? Here is what standing with the Jewish people does not mean. It does not mean that we agree with every decision and policy of the Israeli government. This is important for you to understand when you talk to people. When you say, I stand with Israel, it doesn't mean you agree with everything the Israeli government does, because they do dumb things just like we don't agree with everything our government does. They do dumb things, right? Are you with me? Does that make sense? So when we say that we stand with Israel, it doesn't mean we stand with every decision that they make, because they make mistakes and they do things wrong, right? Just like our government. It also does not mean that we don't pray for and love and support Arab and Palestinian people. So to support one, Israel, does not mean that you cannot or do not support the other. See, in America, we like to do this either-or thing. Right? If you're for Israel, then you're against the Palestinians. That's not true. That's flawed thinking. It can be both and, all right? And those 2 points are very important when you're communicating to people. That when I say I stand with Israel, it does not mean I agree with everything the Israeli government does, and it doesn't mean that I'm against Arabs or Palestinians. We love the Palestinian people. We are heartbroken over what they are having to go through and endure because of the decisions that are made by their terrorist leaders, Hamas. We pray for them, and God loves them. It's very important that we communicate that, right? The Palestinian people so many of them are innocent. The vast majority of them are innocent. In fact, there was a wonderful video that was produced, and I'm going to show it to you one of these weeks, that there's a whole Palestinian underground that is trying to communicate with the outside world and say, we want to be free of our leaders, Hamas. And so this video was produced, and it was sent out through the underground, where they said, please understand that we don't agree with our leadership. We've been held hostage since 2006 by them. All right? And we'll talk more about how the Palestinian territory and the Gaza Strip came into being and all that, all right? So to stand with Israel means we support their right to exist as a people and their right to have their own state. That's what it means to stand with Israel. We support their right to exist as a people. Why is that important? Because you have nations like Iran, Yemen, Syria, right? Lebanon. You have Hezbollah and Hamas and all these terrorist groups that want to exterminate the Jews from the planet. No, we stand with Israel. They have the right to exist as a people, just like you and I have a right to exist as a people. And they have the right to have their own state, just like other people groups have their own states, all right? That's what it means to stand with Israel, all right? So now let's talk about how you can pray for Israel, all right? Here are a few things when you're praying for Israel and standing with Israel to think about and pray for. Number one, pray for the peace and the protection of Jerusalem, Psalm 122:6, all right? Pray for the protection of the Jewish people, and that peace will come to that region. They are surrounded by 22 Arab nations. Can you imagine that? You're the only democracy. Your country's the size of a postage stamp. I'm going to show you some maps in a few minutes. And you're surrounded by 22 Arab nations. You need a lot of prayer. and divine protection. The second thing that you can do is you can pray for the decrease of anti-Semitism. All right? I don't know how that's going to happen, because that thing is a powder keg, and that it just seems to be increasing daily. But we need to pray against anti-Semitism. So as you're praying for the Jews, pray against anti-Semitism. Third, pray for a spiritual awakening in Israel. You may not understand or realize it, but the vast majority of Jews on the planet today are non-observant Jews. What does that mean? They're also referred to as secular Jews as opposed to religious Jews. All right? So if a Jew is non-observant, that means they don't celebrate Judaism. They're not religious Jews. And people ask, well, how could that be? Why would that be? Why aren't they actively serving God? Because after the Holocaust of World War II, many Jews gave up on God. They felt like God had abandoned them, that God did not save them. And so the majority of Jews today are non-observant, what is referred to as secular Jews. And in the state of Israel, the nation of Israel, the majority of Jews there are secular Jews, not religious Jews. They're not Orthodox, they're not ultra-Orthodox, they're not anything. They're cultural Jews. Okay, so that's important for us to understand. So pray for a spiritual awakening within their hearts. 4, pray that Iran will not develop its nuclear weapon. I heard a couple of weeks ago that Iran is 84% complete with their nuclear weapon. And they were saying that by the first of the year, Iran could have a nuclear weapon. You know what's going to happen if Iran gets a nuclear weapon? They're going to try and use it on Israel. Why? Because in the charter of Iran is the elimination of the Jewish people. Just like in Hamas's charter and Hezbollah's charter and all these groups that are backed by Iran. It's right in their charters. Our stated goal is the elimination of the Jewish people. So as soon as they get a nuclear weapon, they're going to try and use it. That's why it was so important that the United States do everything it could to prevent them from getting the materials and the stuff they needed to develop this nuclear weapon, because that's going to be a bad, bad thing. Number 5, pray that the U.S. will remain Israel's ally. We just talked about that. Number 6, pray that God will give Israeli leaders wisdom in this hour. Remember, the Jewish people are fighting for their lives against the people who openly admit to wanting to eliminate them. If that were you, what would you be doing right now? Would you engage in a ceasefire? If people were trying to wipe Americans off the face of the earth, would you engage in a ceasefire? I don't think so. You would do everything you could to eliminate the threat, right? You need to understand that Israel has never been an aggressor in any war. They have always been attacked. All right? Do you know that from the time they turned what is now the Gaza Strip over to the Palestinians, okay, that was done in 2005, from 2006 until now, every day out of the Gaza Strip has come into the cities of Sderot and the other cities along there, missiles. I was in Sderot in 2008. And when I was there in 2008, there hadn't been a day since 2006 that missiles had not been launched either in the morning or the evening onto the city of Sderot. It's a funny story. Robert knew I would never go there. And so he put me in a van with these other pastors, and he didn't tell me where we were going, and he said, "It's a surprise." All the other pastors are snickering the whole ride down because Robert knew if he would have told me we were going to the town where their missiles are coming in every day, I wasn't leaving the hotel. So he gets me in the van, and about 10 minutes away from Sderot, I'm like, "Robert, this kind of looks like a war zone." And all these pastors start laughing. And then Robert goes, Well, I wasn't exactly truthful with you. We're going to Sderot. Well, I knew what Sderot was, but what am I going to do now? I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I'm 10 minutes from the place, and we went there, and the hours that we were there, no bombs came in. But as soon as we got there, the mayor greeted us, and they have these cement pillboxes. They look like telephone booths, except they're complete cement. And they're all over, like every intersection on all the streets. And the mayor said, if you hear the siren go off, you've got 15 to 17 seconds to get into one of those things and close the door. And each one holds like 3 or 4 people, or get to another shelter. So I made sure the whole time we were walking around, I'm making sure I know where that closest bomb shelter is so that I can go, all right? But think about this. Since 2006, every day, they're always shooting rockets into Israel. It got so commonplace, the news doesn't even cover it anymore, and for the majority of time, Israel doesn't even respond back. But then when they finally have enough and they do respond back, then it's all over the news that Israel is bullies, right? These are the kinds of things that you have to understand. So pray that God will give them wisdom in what they do and how they do it. I can tell you that the Jewish people, that Israel want peace. In fact, we're going to get into this as we go through this class, that Israel has given away a lot of land that they rightfully won in war just to obtain peace, including giving back half of Jerusalem to the Muslims. But Golda Meir, former prime minister of Israel, once said this: you can't negotiate with people who want to kill you. And that's why the peace process has never been successful with these terrorist groups, okay? The next one is this: pray that terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah will fall. All right, we need to pray that. We also need to pray against media distortion and lies. And then we need to pray for increased trust between Jews and evangelical Christians, all right, that bond will continue. And finally, pray for Israeli and Palestinian innocents who have become victims of the ongoing conflicts, all right? So that's just a laundry list of things that you can pray for. Now I want to talk about the origin of the state of Israel. Again, this is all foundational material that helps you to understand the conflict. So, the first and foremost thing that you need to understand is that Israel was God's idea. All right? Israel was God's idea. In Genesis, God made a covenant with Abraham. And as a part of that covenant, God gave the Jewish people a land. Now, because of their sin, because of their refusal to repent, we read about it in the Old Testament, they lost that land to other nations. They lost that land to the Assyrians in the north. They lost that land to the Babylonians in the south. But God's promise to them was that one day he would bring them from the farthest corners of the earth where they had been scattered, and he would bring them back to the land, and it would once again be theirs. Where do we find that? Isaiah chapter 43, verses 5 and 6. And so it's interesting that for over 2,000 years, the Jews held on to that promise. And each year, as they would celebrate the Passover and they would celebrate other Jewish feasts and important events, they would always end with this phrase: next year in Jerusalem. All right? Next year in Jerusalem. And that statement was a demonstration of their faith and their belief in God's promise that one day they would return to the land. So how the state of Israel came into being is very important for you to understand, because it provides the answer to much of the misinformation that is spouted by people today saying that Israel is an occupying nation and that they stole the land. So I'm going to show you that nothing could be further from the truth. So the story of Israel actually begins in the late 1800s with two men that I mentioned earlier. A secular Jewish journalist, all right, named Theodor Herzl. So this guy wasn't even an observant Jew. He's a secular Jewish journalist, and an evangelical pastor named William Heckler. And I'll let Robert fill in more details next week. Right now, I'm just going to kind of give you the 35,000-foot version of events. But after Herzl saw continuing persecution and injustice against the Jewish people, Theodor Herzl began a movement to see the Jewish people return to their homeland and even possibly have their own state, because he felt like it was the only way that they could be safe in the world. That movement was called Zionism. So let me define Zionism for you, because people have wrong ideas about what Zionism is. That's one of those terms that gets thrown around and people don't know what they're talking about, all right? Zionism was a Jewish national movement describing the yearning of Jews to return to the land of Israel. That's all it was. It has often been called a racist belief today. But it is not. It is fundamentally opposed to racism. The idea that Zionism, or the desire to have one's own nation, that's all Zionism is, was the idea that it was racist actually came from an Arab-Russian-sponsored UN resolution that was passed on November 10th, 1975, which said this: Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And what that was is it was a ploy to delegitimize Israel as a nation. In fact, the UN Secretary of General at the time, Kofi Annan, described it as a low point in UN history. And so that resolution was actually repealed in 1991. But in 1975, it passed in the UN, right? Here's what you need to know about Israel. Israel is a colorblind society comprised of Jews and non-Jews from at least 100 different countries, from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds. When people think of Israel, they think that the only people that live there are Jewish people, that Israel is all Jewish people. That is not right at all. There are over 100 people from over 100 different countries representing all kinds of ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. Israel is way more diverse than you could possibly imagine. It has become a safe place for many people seeking asylum, including displaced Jews from around the world. The other thing you need to know about Israel is that Israel is not a theocracy, okay? In the Old Testament, Israel was a theocracy when it first began. That means God was the ruler, because Israel didn't have a king, right? Israel is not a theocracy. It is a democracy that is run by an elected parliament called the Knesset. So democracy, not religion, is the cornerstone of Israel. You may not understand this or realize this. Israel has no state religion. Judaism is not the state religion of Israel. All faiths enjoy freedom of worship in Israel, okay? There is no, just like in America, there is no state religion. We don't give preference to anyone. Neither do they do that in Israel. So to be a Christian Zionist means that you support the right of the Jewish people to return to the land of their ancestry. That's all that means, all right? It is not racist, it's not bigoted, it's just that you support the right of the Jewish people to return to the land of their ancestry. So, going back to Theodor Herzl, to promote his idea, Theodor Herzl wrote a book in 1896 called The Jewish State. That book was picked up and read by William Heckler, and it confirmed to him a vision that God had given him of Israel returning to the land. And so Heckler, this evangelical pastor, began to work with Herzl. And in 1897, they convened the first Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland. Now, in that conference, they were not asking for their own state at the time. They were simply encouraging the Jews to return to the land. What is that called? It's called Aliyah. How many of you have ever heard Jews talk about Aliyah, making Aliyah? Making Aliyah is when a Jew returns to their homeland. All right? And the word aliyah simply means this. It means going up. All right? Going up. What's interesting in the scripture is that when you read the Psalms, the psalmist is always talking about, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Let us go up to Jerusalem. And why is that? Because Jerusalem is the highest point in Israel. So when people would travel there for the feast days, they would go up to Jerusalem, okay? Well, Theodore Herzl died in 1904, but the ball was now rolling. Now we fast forward, okay? And by the way, I wanted to show you a picture here of, there's Theodore Herzl. His picture hangs in the Hall of Independence where the Jewish Declaration of Independence was signed in 1948. Even though he wasn't there, he's considered to be, as the father of Zionism, the one who got the ball rolling for Israel to become its own state. All right? So now we fast forward to 1917. At the end of World War I, Great Britain assumed control of the land of Palestine from the Ottomans. A guy by the name of Arthur Balfour was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, and he signed in 1917 what was referred to as the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration promised the Jews their own homeland, that they could have the land. That declaration in 1917 set the stage for what would then happen on November 29th, 1947, after World War II. It was on November 29th, 1947, that the newly formed United Nations proposed a two-state solution based on the Balfour Declaration, giving the Jews and the Arabs their own land and their own states. All right? Now, let me just pause there for a second. An interesting piece of history. While the UN was in session debating whether or not to give land to Israel, a Christian by the name of Rees Howells, he wrote a very famous book some of you may have read called Rees Howells' Intercessor. It's actually a biography of him. One of Christianity's great intercessors, right? He was with his students during that time at Wales Bible College, and they engaged in 11 days of prayer and fasting that the UN would vote yes and give Israel the land to become their own state, because originally, when the proceedings started, there were not enough votes for that resolution to pass in the UN. And when the resolution was passed on November 29th, 1947, Rees Howells said this: "It was the greatest day for the Holy Spirit since the day of Pentecost." Right? So, November 29th, 1947, the UN passes the resolution for a two-state solution. Give Israel their own land and state, give the Arabs their own land and state. And I've already told you what happened. The Arabs refused the two-state solution while the Jews accepted it. And on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel, okay? He declared Israel to be a free and sovereign state in accordance with the UN's approval and granting of a portion of the land of Palestine to them. All right? And so I want to show you here a map of the land that Israel was given. Right? So, we're going to come back to this in a second, but I want you to look at the map on the left. That's originally, all that stuff in that teal green, that's the original size of Israel, right? That was the original land that was given to Israel. So just kind of keep that in mind, okay? I want to also point out that they were not given Jerusalem by the UN. I want you to think about this. What is the most important city to a Jew? Jerusalem. But in the original agreement with the UN, they did not give the Jewish people, if we go back to that, let me go back to that map. Notice where Jerusalem is. Do you see where it is, the dot? It's not in the teal color. They were not given Jerusalem. That's like giving someone a body without giving them a heart. Because Jerusalem is the heart of Judaism. It's the heart of Jerusalem. It's the heart of the Jewish people, all right? But get this. The Jewish people took the deal anyway. Even though they didn't get Jerusalem, they still accepted the deal from the UN. Why is all this important? Because it's important that you understand that Israel did not steal anybody's land. Are you all seeing this? It was given to them by the declaration of the UN. And a two-state solution was proposed back then that would have eliminated all of this stuff that's gone on since. It was given to them through the Balfour Declaration and by a UN resolution. They are not occupiers. The land was given to them. So all the talk that you hear about a two-state solution is bogus, because do you realize a two-state solution has been offered to the Arabs on at least 4 different occasions starting in 1947, and they have rejected the two-state solution every single time. Israel would be happy with a two-state solution. Israel has offered and agreed to a two-state solution multiple times. So the question we have to ask is why, when a two-state solution is offered, since that's what you hear about all the time, we want our own state, we want Palestine to be free, all right? We've been around this bush before. Why do they keep rejecting it? Because they do not want their own state. That's not the goal. The goal is the elimination of Israel and the Jewish people. And that's why the Arabs will never agree to a two-state solution. This is why there's been no peace in the Middle East, and there never will be as long as terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran exist. Because their charters, again, call for the elimination of the Jewish people. If they settle for a two-state solution, guess what they'll have to do? Shut up. And they'll have to run that state. And they'll run that state like they've run the Gaza Strip. They'll run it right into the ground. They don't want a two-state solution because their whole goal is to keep this conflict going so that they can make Israel look bad and turn the world against them and hopefully eliminate them. Therefore, it's in the best interests of these terrorist groups to keep the people of Gaza poor and destitute, and to even see them killed for political reasons because it suits their agenda. And this, my friends, is what people do not understand and they do not grasp. The Arabs, those that are against Israel. And now, thankfully, over the last few years, we've seen Arab countries. You know, it's really interesting, the timing of the October 7th attack. It happened right before what was going to happen. Israel was supposed to sign an accord agreement with Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other Arab nations that have now said, you know what, we want to be friends with Israel. Do you realize that Saudi Arabia has now removed all curriculum in their schools that say Jews should be eliminated? Because they understand it is good for them to be economically aligned with the Jewish people. It's good for them to be friends with the Jewish people. There is a generation of Arabs that are growing up that said, we're tired of this nonsense. And so Iran wanted to stop that accord, that agreement from being signed. And so that's why they got Hamas to do what they did as their proxy. Because what has happened to the accord now? Got all blown up. Didn't happen, right? So again, it's understanding all of these different things that are happening behind the scenes, all right? So let me share one more thing before we quit tonight. And I want to talk to you about the miracle of Israel. There's another reason that Israel is accused of being occupiers, and to understand that, you need to understand the miracle of Israel since becoming a state. 4 minutes after David Ben-Gurion declared Israel a state, on May 14th, 1948, President Harry Truman signed a document recognizing Israel's statehood. America was the first to acknowledge Israel as a nation. Right? Nobody else wanted to acknowledge Israel as a nation. Why? Because they knew the Arabs were unhappy about it. And they didn't want to tick the Arabs off because the Arabs hold the oil. But Harry Truman remembered what he had learned in Sunday school from his Sunday school teacher, that God said, I will bless those who bless you. And so, against the advice of all of his cabinet members, it's a fascinating story, another story that doesn't get told. Harry Truman acknowledges Israel's statehood 4 minutes after Israel becomes a state and says, we stand with Israel. All right? He did that because of what he learned in Sunday school. Isn't that amazing how God brought that back to them? 16 minutes after that. So now Israel's been a state for 20 minutes, a whole 20 minutes. The Arab nations surrounding Israel, all right? So all of those nations in green, there's Israel, the little blue dot. Look at all of the Muslim nations that surround Israel. 20 minutes after they declared themselves a state, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen declared war on Israel. This was called the War for Independence. It lasted 8 months, and it resulted in a stunning Israeli victory. Why do I say stunning? Because Israel had only been a state for 20 minutes. Israel was outmanned. They were outgunned in every way. It was impossible for Israel to defeat all of those nations that had armies and air forces and everything else. They didn't even have anything put together. There were makeshift Jews living in the land. So, except for God helping them to win, they could have never won the war for independence. Here are the facts. They had 18,000 men, 10,000 rifles. So they didn't even have a rifle for every man. They had 3,600 machine guns. They had 2 tanks and 4 planes. And 2 of those 4 planes got shot down the first day. Can you imagine America going to war against anybody with that kind of resource? They were fighting against full air forces from the other nations. But by the time the war was over, Israel had won almost 3 times the amount of land that they had originally been given. So now, here's where the facts are important. Originally, they were given 3,000 square miles of land in the UN agreement. But after the War for Independence victory, they had 8,000 square miles of land. So they increased by 5,000 because guess what happens when you win? You get territory. Every time America won a war, it got what? Territory. All right? So after the War of Independence, they now move from 3,000 to 8,000 square miles of land. Now fast forward to 1967. Egypt launches a surprise, unprovoked attack against Israel during Shabbat. Okay? Shabbat is sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. That's their Sabbath, Shabbat, all right? This was referred to as the 6-Day War. Why was it referred to as the 6-Day War? Because Israel beat Egypt in 6 days. Again, they were outmanned, they were under-resourced, but they beat the Egyptians in an embarrassing defeat. A victory that could only be attributed to God. And so now look what happens. After the 6-Day War, Israel's landmass grows from 8,000 square miles to, get this, 26,000 square miles. Because, you see what's in the lighter teal color? The Sinai and the West Bank and the Golan Heights at the top? Look at the original land. And now look at after 1967. Because of the 2 wars, the battle for the War of Independence and the 6-Day War, Israel wins all of that land. Right? So see where Gaza is? Israel won that. West Bank, Israel won that. Golan Heights, Israel won that. Now Egypt is ticked off. They're embarrassed, all right? And now the rumors start to fly. Israel has stolen our land. How ridiculous. They did not steal their land. They won their land. Now, fast forward to 1973, because there is a third important battle that you need to be aware of. In 1973, embarrassed by their defeat in 1967, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, how many of you remember that name? Because later in the 1970s, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, signed a very important peace accord between the Jews and the Egyptians that is still held to this day, all right? It is still held to this day, right? By the way, Anwar Sadat is assassinated because of that agreement that he made with the Jews, all right? So it cost him his life. Remember I said to stand with the Jewish people can be uncomfortable and costly. But in 1973, Anwar Sadat, because he's embarrassed by his loss in 67, decides to attack Israel again and get back the land they lost and restore national pride. So they attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973. And this became known as the Yom Kippur War. Why is this current conflict of great interest? Because when did Hamas attack? Same time, Yom Kippur, all right? Yom Kippur for the Jews is the Day of Atonement. And so this war lasted for 19 days, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And again, Israel won in a stunning upset. And the victory could only be attributed to God. Now, Israel's landmass moves from 26,000 square feet to 26,000 square miles to 36,000 square miles. All right? So let me just put this map up on the screen. And here's a map that shows you what happened. All right? So we have the West Bank outline, but notice the progression. 1917, the Ottomans have it. Then the British have it. 1918, 1946. The first UN resolution, all right? Look at how small Jewish Palestine is. And by the way, Arab Palestine and Jerusalem in there, that was supposed to be the second state, all right? And then you move to 1948, and then you see Israel go greater, and then Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War. And then that last slide we'll talk about in future weeks, that's where Israel begins to give land back to them, parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. All right, all in an effort to get peace, right? So why am I telling you all this stuff? Because Israel is accused of being occupiers and stealing land, but they didn't steal it. They were attacked, and they won the land in war. It's kind of interesting. The British aren't asking the United States to give back the land that they lost in the Revolutionary War, right? If the British started talking about the Americans as occupiers, people would laugh at them. They would say, you lost that land. So basically what I'm trying to tell you, it's all sour grapes. I want you to take note that Israel has never attacked an Arab state or group or been the aggressor in any conflict. This is the key. Every time they have to defend themselves, they have only fought to protect and defend themselves. They have been very gracious. They have deeded back land to Arab groups that they won over the years to demonstrate that they wanted to live in peace with their Arab neighbors. But nothing Israel does is ever good enough. Why? Because the goal is their destruction. And so in coming weeks, I'm going to talk about the land that Israel has given back, including half of Jerusalem, which they won outright. But then they gave half of it back as a gesture of peace, including the Temple Mount. All right? And during each of these wars, Israel has seen bona fide biblical miracles. I mean, amazing stuff. In the 1967 Six-Day War, 2 Israeli tanks were coming over a sand dune and right into an entire Egyptian tank unit. With no explanation, the Egyptians jumped out of their tank screaming, and they ran away through the desert. And the Israelis could not figure out what in the world was going on. Later, in a documentary series called Against All Odds, Israel Survives, you can watch it, it's on Amazon Prime right now. They tell the story, they interview these Egyptians that were in this tank unit, thousands of men. Why did you turn and run away? And they say, what do you mean, why did we turn and run away? There were thousands of Israelis there, armed to the hilt. They were going to wipe us out. And the Israelis are like, we had 2 tanks and a couple of men. It's a miracle of biblical proportions. And so whether it was the War for Independence, the Six-Day War of 67, or the Yom Kippur War in 1973, there are all these miracle stories that Jewish combat forces tell of strange things like that happened where they won when they shouldn't have won. And then one of the last things I want to tell you about tonight that is very, very important, because it has to do with the current conflict over Gaza and the Palestinian people. You need to understand that there have been Jews that have been living in the land of Israel. They've been living in the land of Israel for centuries. All right? In 1882, there were 24,000 Jews living in the land. So I'm going to put up some statistics right now. Right? So in 1882, there were 24,000 Jews that were living in the land in 17 agricultural colonies. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, was living in one such colony. Here's what I want you to know. There was no people group called the Palestinians until 1968, all right? When Russia told Yasser Arafat that the way for him to engender sympathy for his new PLO terrorist organization was to create a Palestinian people group and tell the world that they had been displaced from their land by Israel. So the idea of a Palestinian people group was birthed in 1968 for political reasons. You will not find any mention of Palestinian people prior to that because they didn't exist. They were people that were living in the land of Palestine, but there was no Palestinian people group. So where do we get this group from? Well, Yasser Arafat formed the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in 1964, which was a terrorist group specifically designed to create an Arab state and eliminate Israel. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't going well. It wasn't having traction. And so Russia encouraged him to come up with this story of the Palestinian people who've been living in the land for thousands of years and had their land stolen by the Israelis. But where did this Palestinian group of people that we now talk about so much, where did they come from? They were Arabs who were living in the land of Palestine in 1948 when they were told by their Arab brothers who were attacking Israel in that first war to leave the land so that they could be safe. So they left the land of, at that time, Israel, because it had been given to Israel, while those Arab nations attacked them in the war for independence. Their Arab brothers said, once we defeat Israel, then you can move back into the land. But something that they didn't expect happened. Israel won. And when the Arabs were defeated by Israel, the Arabs who had left the land were not allowed entry back into the land owned by Israel, and they found themselves displaced and living in camps. What is even more interesting is that the 7 Arab nations that told them to leave refused to take them into their own countries, and they hung their brothers out to dry and have kept them in a state of wandering as refugees for political gain ever since. Even today, the Arab countries surrounding Israel will not take in the Palestinians. They simply use them. Very important to understand that. By the way, every Arab who stayed in the land of Israel during the War for Independence was given full-fledged citizenship by the Israeli government. Because you realize that Israel's often accused of mistreating the Palestinian people or Arab people or whatever. That's not true. All of the Arabs, 26% of the the Israeli population is Arab. They have full citizenship, full voting rights. They sit in the parliament, and even there's an Arab on the Israeli Supreme Court. All right? Stuff that people don't know. And over the years, all the aid and supplies given by the world to the Palestinians never reaches them because of Arab corruption. It's all funneled to terrorist organizations. And so while the Palestinian people have remained poor and they've suffered, Yasser Arafat's widow, when he died, moved to Paris with $300 million in her bank account. Now, where did a poor shepherd called Yasser Arafat get $300 million from? Did you notice today Israel released documentation about Hamas's leaders and how they live, and that they're worth $4 billion, $4 billion, $4 billion, and $3 billion, each of their 4 top leaders. They live in lavish luxury while their Palestinian brothers live in squalor in Gaza City. These are the things that people don't get, all right? So we're gonna stop there tonight. Again, lots more stuff. Next week, Bishop Robert Stearns is going to talk to you about a few things. It will be really good what he has to share next week. And so I encourage you to be here for that. He's going to take some of these things that I've talked about. He's going to embellish on them. He's going to talk to you at length about replacement theology. He's going to talk to you about the history of the conflict more than I have, to give you an even better understanding. All right? Any questions that you have tonight about what we've heard at all? This is being recorded tonight on our regular Sunday live stream. So this will be up on our website. You'll be able to view it, send friends to view it if they want the information that you've gotten tonight, or other people in the church that couldn't be here, didn't watch it live. We're recording it so that it can be put up for people. Yes? You're welcome. You're welcome. Did you learn some things tonight that you never knew that were kind of surprising? Well, guess what? During this whole class, you're going to learn a lot more surprising things about Israel, because I'll tell you what, when you go to the land of Israel, everything becomes very clear to you. And Crystal and I have both been there multiple times, and when you get there, all of a sudden you realize, man, the media has duped me. Like, there are so many lies told, and you get to go to the place, you get to see what's really happening there. So we're going to talk about the West Bank. We're going to talk about the wall that was built there and why it was built. And again, everything that Israel does has had to be for self-defense, to protect themselves. They have never actively been aggressors. They want peace more than anybody, but they can't seem to get it. Because I go back to that quote from Golda Meir: how do you negotiate with people that want to kill you? They won't negotiate with you. Yeah, question. So I'm not a student of the Quran, so I can't verify whether that's true or not. So I can't really answer the question. So the question was, is it true that in the Quran, when the Muslims conquer a territory, that they're never to give it up? It's probably true. It's probably in there. I can't confirm it because I haven't studied the Quran and I don't know what it says. So that could be true. It could be false. But it certainly it would certainly tend to be in keeping with kind of the feel of things that, you know, they don't want. And when we talk about Jerusalem, Jerusalem has gone back and forth into the hands. The Muslims have had it twice. The Christians had it once. The Jews had it. There's always a battle over that. There's a battle over the Temple Mount, all of that stuff. Dane in the back. That is correct. Yes. Yes. So that's actually what happened in the UN resolution. Israel got very little land, but the comment by Dane was that when the British owned the land of Palestine right after World War I, they were the first to propose a two-state solution. That is correct. And that's what I was telling you tonight. That whole thing, that Balfour Declaration, didn't come to manifestation until the UN resolution, November 29th, 1947, when they offered the two-state solution that was proposed by the Balfour Declaration. And yes, the amount of land that Israel got was very little, and it did not include Jerusalem. But they took it because they wanted their own land. Again, the Arabs declined the two-state solution. And so these are the things that, people that are protesting, a lot of our students, they are not students of history. They do not have the facts. They don't understand. They're parroting stuff that they hear, right? If you ask them, define for me, why are you calling the Jews occupiers? They'll say things, well, they stole the land. Well, just go through and give them the timeline. They could get that timeline out of Wikipedia or any Google search. I mean, it's all there, right? But they don't want to know because, and I'm going to come back to this thing again, there is a demonic deception, a veil that is over people's eyes. So even when it's right there in front of them, they won't see it. They won't agree to it because this is all demonically driven. So that's the one thing that you have to keep coming back to, because otherwise you're going to rip your hair out because you're going to say, it doesn't make sense. I told them the truth and they still don't believe me. I showed them the truth, they still. It's because they're blinded by demonic deception. All right? So don't be surprised if you share the facts with people and they still look you straight in the face and say, Israel stole the land. Israel's occupiers. Jews should die. Because that's what happens when demonic deception falls over a people. All right? All right, well, thanks for being here tonight. We will see you on Sunday.